hello all you fine people out there. Welcome back to the channel. Well, this is a comparison that I've been wanting to do for a long time now, and I was spurred on by one of my viewers' comments recently, and that is a comparison between the Smith Corona Silent Super and the Olympia SM-3. Stay tuned. Well, both of these machines hail from the 1950s. They both have the older keyboard style that lacks the number 1. They're both an American-style keyboard. They both have a crinkly paint finish, and they both have kind of the same general size and weight. They're medium-sized portable typewriters. They both have fairly long and shapely carriage return levers, and they're both considered pretty good machines in their class. So I'm curious as to how these two machines are going to rate, and in terms of features, but also the more subjective things, right? Like how they feel, how the typing action feels, and just the general appearance of the machine. Of course, a lot of that being subjective is up to the individual reviewer or user, so in my case, I might take preference over one versus the other, but let's see what happens with this review. Stay tuned. So the Silent Super has been in my collection longer than the SM-3. I got this from a Craigslist ad locally here in Albuquerque. And I've told you the story before about this. This is one of these typewriters that was very, very grungy and dirty. It had an intermittent skipping problem, and it took me a long time of troubleshooting and cleaning and degreasing, and really it was purchasing the Typewriter Repair Bible from Ted Monk that really got me set on the course of getting the remainder of the problems fixed on this machine. And so after it became very reliable, I had all the rubber parts replaced by J.J. Short just about maybe 6 months ago. And so this is the one typewriter in my collection that has all new rubber parts, and it is a sweet typewriter. This SM-3, my wife and grandson went to a thrift store about 9 months ago, sometime last year in 2019. They saw the typewriter. They didn't know if it was worth buying. They weren't as up on the models and brands as I am, or you might be, for instance. But what they did is the typewriter in its case, they hid the typewriter inside a piece of furniture in the thrift store so that nobody else would find it. And then when they came home, they told me about it when I got home from work. And so that next weekend, I went over and I said, heck yeah! And it turned out to be in really remarkably clean shape. Absolutely beautiful typewriter. This kind of dark greenish, grayish green. The crinkle paint finish on the Olympias seems to be a finer type of texture than on the Smith Corona, but the Smith Corona here shows a lot more wear. There's a wear on the corners of the ribbon cover where it's been worn down to smooth paint, along with the front corners next to the space bar. And so I think this machine has just been through a lot more usage and abuse, as evidenced by the dirty condition it was in, whereas this one is really in remarkably good shape. Okay, aside from the subjective and aesthetic differences between the machines, from a strictly functional standpoint, what's the difference? Well, basically, the keyboards, though they both lack the number 1, the Olympia has, to the left of the number 2, it has a plus and equals key. Could have been a number 1, but it's not. And it has some additional fractions, like a 3/4 fraction and an exclamation mark on the upper right here, that the Smith Corona doesn't have. The Smith Corona's keyboard is kind of an older style keyboard from the earlier 50s, where this Olympia is a transitional keyboard to just before when they put the number 1 on the keyboards. The Olympia has tab slugs that are adjustable in the back of the machine, but it's not a universal tab system. You can't put a tab at every print position along the carriage, whereas the Smith Corona has the tab set and clear, the key set tabulator. The line spacing on the Olympia is 1, 1.5, and 2. So the single line spacing has 2 positions, 2 half spaces, whereas the Smith Corona is a 1, 2, 3, full line spacing. As far as the character spacing, the Smith Corona is a full space machine. So one press and release of the keyboard is one whole space, whereas on the Olympia, it is a half space machine. You press the space bar down, the carriage moves a half space, you release it, it moves the other half space. The backspace on the Olympia is on the right side of the keyboard. The backspace on the Smith Corona, of course, is on the left side of the keyboard. The bichrome setting on both machines is on the right side, and the Smith Corona has a manual ribbon reversing lever up here on the upper left corner, whereas the Olympia does not. Both machines do feature a flip-up ribbon cover. The Olympia, however, does not have a left-hand carriage release lever. It only has a right-hand carriage release lever, whereas the Smith Corona has both left and right. So in that regards, the old SM-3s here, kind of that's the one feature that it really lacks, because it is a medium-sized portable, and you would expect only ultra portables, very compact, lightweight portables, to be lacking a carriage release lever on the left side, but sure enough, the SM-3 lacks it, at least this era of SM-3. I'll get into more detailed comparisons about the differences between the two keyboards later, but right now, just looking at the two machines, you might be able to tell that the keyboard sits higher above the work table than the Olympia. The spacebar on the Smith Corona is obviously higher than the Olympia, and we'll measure the spacing of the keys and their vertical heights later on. But it's interesting, there are different shapes, of course. The keys on the Smith Corona are this kind of oval shaped, and the keys on the Olympia are more rectangular, kind of trapezoid shape. Okay, the line spacing variable on the Smith Corona, so it has a variable adjustment right here in the front left of the platen, and that one is the temporary variable. When you put it back to the ratcheting position, you go back to your original ratchet, and then it has the clutch is the push button in the middle of the left platen knob, and that is a permanent adjustment to your line spacing. On the Olympia, you have a lever that pushes down behind the hinge point of the carriage return lever. You push that down and you get into the temporary line spacing adjustment, and if you flip it back, you go back to the original ratcheting position, your original line position. Whereas if you push this button in on the right side of on the middle of the right platen knob, you will get to the permanent clutch adjustment for the line spacing. So they both have the similar features. Paper scales. Okay, the Smith Corona has a scale down below the platen along the front, the bottom of the carriage right here. The Olympia doesn't have a paper scale there along the bottom. It does have, however, a paper scale along the paper bale itself, whereas this era of Smith Corona just has a round chrome-plated paper bale with no scale on it. They both have a scale, though, back on the paper table back behind here. Smith Corona's has the paper guide in that scale system, whereas the Olympia has the paper guide in front of that scale on a separate plate. They both have very similar margin settings, push and slide margins. The Smith Corona's is just behind that scale, so you use that same scale as a reference. And the Olympia's is just in front of its paper scale back here. You pinch it and slide instead of push and slide, and you're using the same scale as a reference for your margins. Now, one thing I do like about the Olympia's paper scale that's on the bale is there is a red triangle marking the center of the carriage, which is really nice, whereas the Smith Corona's doesn't really have that kind of a marking, even on the scale that's down below the platen that's viewable through the hole or the gap in the vibrator area. There's also a corresponding red center triangle on the rear scale here as well. On the paper bale, both of these typewriters have fingers. The Olympia has a finger on both ends of the paper bale, whereas the Smith Corona only has one on the right side. So again, another compromise. Carriage locking. The Smith Corona has that system whereby you move the carriage to the right of center and then you push up on this lever, and it will bring the carriage back to the center, but it doesn't actually lock it, because if there's enough motion of the carriage, a sudden jarring could move it to the right, which would release that, and then another jar to the left would put force on one of the teeth of the escapement cog. So it's only securely protecting the escapement cog in shipment if it's in its case. The case itself prevents the carriage from moving any further. But if you're trying to ship it any other way, this is not a true lock. Whereas on the Olympia, you have this push button lock here. You actually pull it up to lock the carriage like that, and it's a true lock. It's truly locked. You have to push it down to unlock it. The Olympia has a plastic card guide in the front on either side of the ribbon, and they're hinged. They have their hinged spring tension. This particular machine, the right-hand one, the plastic is cracked partly, so it's kind of hanging there by one little mounting point. And those are brittle and fragile, and that's a common problem to a lot of the Olympias. Whereas the Smith Corona does not have a plastic card guide of any kind. It just has the two little fingers up here on either side of the print position just above it. Okay, let's talk about ribbon reversing for a minute. The Smith Coronas use the eyelet method of reversing. So there's a forked guide on either side behind the ribbon, and the eyelet at the end of the ribbon is going to push on that forked guide and cause the reversing action to happen. Whereas on the Olympias, they use a back tension method. So when the ribbon gets near the end, the ribbon gets tighter, and that causes the lever to flip based on back tension alone. And so the Olympias don't use eyelets on their auto-reversing system. Now, one of the other major functional differences between both typewriters, and this may be a deal breaker for somebody, is the Olympia is a carriage shift machine, meaning when you're shifting, typically if you're a touch typist, you're going to be using the weakest fingers of your hand, your pinkies. You're going to be pushing up the entire weight of the carriage with those little fingers, whereas the Smith Corona is a segment shift or basket shift machine, meaning you're just pushing the segment down. Its own weight is helping you, and you're just pushing against a gentle spring pressure. So it's a lot easier to segment shift than it is to carriage shift. But that is the difference there with the Olympia. Another thing about the paper bale I should point out on both machines is the Smith Corona has 3 paper bale rollers, and the Olympia has 2 paper bale rollers. Okay, let's look at the backs of the machines. So the Smith Corona has this rabbit ear style paper support that comes up spring-loaded like that, and then the rear panel hinges back part way, like a 45-degree angle. You can see the individual slugs for the key set tabulator down there. I think the main benefit of being able to pull this panel loose, though, is when you want to go remove the platen. The Smith Corona has the quick removable platen, whereas obviously the Olympia doesn't, because very few other typewriters had an easily removable platen like Smith Coronas do. The Olympia has your adjustable tab stops. So they provide 6 tab stops here that you can push and slide to set your tabs. And it has a push button on the right side that folds up the paper support, and the paper support is indexed with numbers that you can use when you first thread your paper in here. If you push the top down to touch the top of the paper, or which would be the bottom of the paper, then as you're typing and the top edge of the paper comes up, when it touches up here, you're going to be at the same distance on the bottom of the paper as you started at the top. It's an end of page indicator, and it's very elegantly simple, whereas the Smith Corona has the more complex end of page indicator that's built onto the left side of the platen. As far as the styling, I think I really like the looks of the Olympia. It has a lot of beautiful chrome trim around the side of the body here, like around the rim of the ribbon cover. And also along the base of the machine, the whole bottom edge of it is encircled in chrome, whereas The Smith Corona is a little bit less decorative. I would say quite a bit less decorative, really. The shape of it is more this kind of that melted candy bar look, you might call it. The only real chrome you're seeing on this typewriter is some of the parts up on the carriage itself, your carriage return lever, your paper bail. It's not quite as nice of a looking typewriter as the Olympia. I think the Olympia really has it beat as far as an elegant mid-century appearance. Both machines have about the same size space bar. They're both about 7 inches or 18 centimeters wide. That brings to mind the question of the keyboard geometry, the spacing of the keys, and how high the tiers are, how steep the tiers go between both machines. So the Smith Corona, the key spacing horizontally, I'm using the bottom row as a reference. It is 172 millimeters from the left key to the right key. And on the Olympia, it is 167 millimeters. So the Olympia's keyboard is a little bit narrower than the Smith Corona's. Now, one thing I've mentioned before with other typewriter comparisons has to do with the clearance between the A key and the left shift lock key. And this a lot of times has to do with how well the touch typing experience works. Oftentimes when you have the shift lock being too close to the A key, you're going to miss-hit the A key, and that happens a lot, especially since if you're right-hand dominant, the A key is being struck with the weakest finger of your weakest hand, and it's the third most frequent letter in English, so you do hit it quite often. So on both of these machines, the shift lock and shift keys on the left are significantly lower than the A key. Certainly that's true with the Smith Corona, and it's also true with the Olympia. The Olympia is not quite as low, and I would say the spacing between the A and the shift lock on the Smith Corona is about 7 millimeters. It looks to be closer to about 5 millimeters, maybe 4 millimeters on the Olympia, so a little bit closer, but it's again lower down than the A key. So when I do some test typing here and give you my impressions of actually typing, we'll talk about that. How does it feel? Does it feel crowded? Obviously, the dimensions width-wise, the Olympia seems to be a narrower keyboard. Is this going to favor smaller hands or people with skinny or longer fingers? If you have beefy, fatter fingers, maybe this is more of a crowded keyboard. Well, we'll see. So I'm trying to measure the distance from the front row to the back row, and on the Olympia it looks like it's about 56 millimeters, so about 60 millimeters on the Smith Corona. So the Smith Corona, the rows of keys are a little bit spaced, a little bit wider apart from front to back than on the Olympia, which is probably proportional to the fact that the Olympia is a narrower keyboard as well. Okay, let's measure the height difference. So I'm going to measure the face of each keycap down to the table surface using the 6 or 7 key row on the back, and I'll measure the back one, the front one, and then we'll take the difference. That'll tell us the height of the slope of the keyboard, relatively speaking. So the Smith Corona Silent Super, starting with 94 and 64. So 94 minus 64 is 30 millimeters height difference. And with the Olympia, and 87, 57. So again, 30 millimeter height difference. So it looks like the Smith Corona is a little bit wider front to back, 4 millimeters wider than the Olympia. They both have the same height, and so that makes the Olympia just a very slightly steeper sloping keyboard. I think the big difference really as far as touch is going to be, or ergonomics, will be the fact that the Olympia has a narrower keyboard, horizontally speaking. It's roughly 16.7 millimeters between center to center of each key on the Olympia versus 17.2 millimeters center to center on the Smith Corona. And as far as the key faces themselves, the Smith Coronas are 15 millimeters wide versus 13 millimeters for the SM-3. Well, measuring the keyboard geometry is one metric that you might be able to use to figure out which one of these typewriters might appeal to you. But really, there's no substitute for actually trying out the machine yourself. And so that's what it's going to come down to. In spite of the fact that I know this might be a slightly more crowded keyboard than this one, well, there's nothing that beats a typing test. So I'm going to use this 32-pound, 100% cotton Southworth typing paper, pretty high quality paper here. Give it a fair shake. Starting with the Smith Corona Silent Super. All right, that has a very nice smooth typing feel to it, I got to admit. And especially with new rubber parts, this is not really hardly loud at all. It has a pretty quiet sound to it. Well, let's take the same piece of paper, let's roll it into the Olympia and see how it feels. Okay, again, 32-pound Southworth 100% cotton paper for when the paper cost doesn't matter at all. Interesting comparison. So, first of all, the touch on the Olympia is just wonderful. Smith Corona has a great touch too, but there's something about that Olympia touch that's just wonderful. I do find myself mishitting the keys more. Of course, I'm not used to typing on the Olympia. This is my wife's typewriter. I've been doing more typing on the Smith Corona than on the Olympia, so it'll take me some time getting used to. It is a nice machine. I don't really find myself mishitting the A at all. I find it easy to strike the A, and the actual action of the key is easy to hit. I should also mention, I didn't mention earlier, but there is a touch adjustment on the Smith Corona and on the Olympia. The Olympia's touch adjustment here is on the right side underneath the ribbon cover, whereas the Smith Corona's is on the left side underneath the ribbon cover right there. So they both have a touch adjustment, and they're both set to about the middle of their range right now. So the bell certainly on the Olympia is louder than on the bell on my Smith Corona, but I will say the biggest difference I notice immediately is the loudness. The platen, because the rubber on this Olympia is hard, it is much louder than on the Smith Corona with the same nice thick paper. So having a fresh platen makes a huge difference. So on these two particular machines, this Smith Corona is a Elite or of 12 characters per inch. The Olympia is 11 characters per inch, which is really like 4 characters per centimeter. Well, I think the obvious answer to the question, which machine would you choose, would be both of them. If you can collect more than one typewriter, you keep both. I think overall the Olympia has got to be the better engineered typewriter. There's no doubt about it. But the Smith Corona has certain attributes about it that makes it easy to service. The platen is removable by the user. There's a lot of parts underneath the machine, like the escapement mechanism, for instance, on the Smith Corona, that are just a lot easier to get to than on the Olympia. And the service literature seems to be well written for the lay technician to understand and do the adjustments for in the case of the Smith Corona. I think the Olympia really needs new rubber. It needs a new platen, that's for certain. It would make this one extra level higher than what it is already. As it is, though, you have to really appreciate the Smith Coronas because they were probably not as expensive, I don't think, as an Olympia back in their day. And they weren't built to quite the same engineering standards and material quality as the Olympias, but they did really good on the design of it. There's certainly something, though, about the Olympia touch that is a precise feel. Certainly these older, earlier Olympias have it more so than the later, let's say, SM-8 or 9s. These SM-3 and 4s of this era, really wonderful machines. And so if you find yourself looking for either one of these, you can't go wrong. But if you can find an Olympia SM-3 or 4 in good condition, you want to pick that up for sure. It is a great machine. They're both good machines, of course. Well, there you go. A little comparison between the Smith Corona Silent Super, Olympia SM-3, mid-century, medium-sized portable typewriters. Both of these are workhorse typewriters. Very good quality. Will last you years if you care for them. Last you half a century. Here you go. More than half a century, right? So, well, if any questions, concerns, comments, hey, I'd love to have a dialogue with you down below in the comment section about these typewriters. What do you guys think? Do you guys like Smith Coronas over Olympias, or is it more the case of, at least in the United States, Olympias are harder to get and Smith Coronas are easier to find, maybe, whereas over in Europe it may be the opposite situation, right? Well, anyways, let's have a dialogue about these great typewriters, and I love them. And again, as always, during these times, these unsettled, trying times, I wish you guys the very best. Stay well, stay healthy, physically, mentally, spiritually, and stay creative as well. Have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.